There was a mighty nation, blessed above all of creation. It was a rare and precious pearl, conceived in faith and liberty, home of the brave, land of the free. It was the envy of the world. But this shining city on a hill has turned from the Creator's will and let evil take control. Now the reckless men who lead them want to strip away their freedom and to steal their very soul. Now it's smoke and mirrors, switching bait, criticize and confiscate and let the guilty walk away. In this once righteous, godly nation, in the halls of education, they forbid a child to pray. They say we need to spread the wealth. They pretend to guard the health of the feeble and the poor, while the hand they hold behind their back confuses and conceals the fact that the wolf is at the door. There's an unseen hand that pulls strings.
Well, good morning, America, and welcome to Connecting the Dots with Dan Happel. And today we've got a very good friend of mine on the radio show, Michael Shaw. Michael Shaw is an attorney, a CPA from California. He's worked very, very closely on the anti-UN Agenda 21 program for many years. In fact, that's where I met Michael. I'd say about somewhere around 10 years ago. He did a tour of Montana with a good friend of mine from the Flathead, Clarice Ryan, who brought him to the state, and I ended up becoming his personal chauffeur, and we got to be really good friends. And over a period of time, that friendship has evolved into a really good working relationship as well as a friendship. And Michael, welcome to the show. And today we're going to be talking about regionalism and councils of government, and we're going to be connecting some dots here with a lot of the different programs around the country and how they all tie into this UN Agenda 21 program that really involves taking away representative local government and replacing it with regional councils of government. And Michael, welcome to the show. And is there anything you want to add to that as far as your background?
Well, I'm happy to be here, Dan, and I'm fine and ready to go. I mean, I think the world is in an exciting position today. I mean, a few years ago, things looked rather bleak, and the whole political dynamic has begun to change everywhere, or in most places, but certainly not in California. And it's always been said that as California goes, so goes the rest of the country. And let's hope we break that trend, because the continuing trends in California are as ominous as ever. And that's what we're going to talk about today, is the advance of regionalism and through COGs. And of course, COGs exist throughout the country. And what happens here is intended by the COG system to reoccur everywhere. So what happens with the regionalist thrust and the COG takeover that is occurring in California, and that's what we're going to discuss today, is something the rest of the country needs to be aware of. Most Californians have no idea this is going on. The newspapers don't cover it, and it's quietly sliding through the California governmental apparatus, which will result in California really becoming a undemocratic, unrepublican place where councils and centralized government take control of all forces, economic and social and whatever, in California. And this is something you don't want to see repeated in Arizona and Nebraska and Rhode Island. They're prepared to do that, but if we can stop in California, I think that we can put to the end the greatest threat that I think America has ever experienced.
Okay, good. Will you tell our listeners just exactly what COGs are and how they work and how they end up replacing duly elected representative government with unelected councils and groups of so-called professional planners.
Well, a COG is a council of government. COGs were originated, people are surprised when they hear this, they originated in the 1950s under Dwight Eisenhower. And it was a way to build the national freeway system. You got to remember that the federal government had no authority, and still has no authority, to build an international or a national freeway system. The Constitution gives the federal government the power to create a national postal system, but not a national freeway system. And so what happened in the 1950s was that COGs were established, councils of government, in every locale, and they combined with the creation of what's called the Metropolitan Transit Commission, an MTC. And these two entities together worked to coordinate the creation of our national freeway system. Well, nobody's going to complain the freeway system was created, but it created a system of government whereby extra-constitutional activities could be created through this federally coordinated system of COGs all around the country in order to make national changes without constitutional authorization. And so, COGs kind of quietly sat on the sidelines with their freeway work and their local transportation issues for decades. COGs were adopted state by state. In the 1970s, it was Ronald Reagan who brought them to California. Reagan proclaimed that COGs were the new form of government, that they were going to replace the outdated and outmoded local system of government. And I think people didn't know what he meant when he said that. And he may not have known what he meant when he said that. But in fact, that's exactly what is happening. Because today, COGs, Council of Government, which is made up of a representative from every city and every county within its region. That's a term deployed by COGs. It's really an anti-American concept. The idea is that we're governed by regions and not by cities and counties anymore. Because regions are much more amorphous. It allows government manipulators to decide what, when, and where the region is and how the region is to be guided and governed. And
okay.
So
no, I was going to say, Michael, one of the things with this regional concept is that we also replace elected local officials with appointed bureaucratic professional planners and groups that sometimes are also funded by unelected stakeholder councils and foundations, and a lot of the influence that's come into our local government has been as a result of this kind of thinking. Is that correct?
Well, yes, that's generally correct. I mean, what a COG does is that, again, they're federally created, and so the center figures in each COG then choose those members of their local COG, and the way they choose them is they go out and they find similarly thinking or manipulatable elected officials from those cities and counties, and they put their best step forward, which is a collectivist who are going to centralize all authority, and they find these people on each elected board, and they put those members on the COG. So if you take a list of the members of your COG, if you have a COG, wherever you are in America, there is a COG that's operating. And the members of that COG are elected officials who will go along with their program. So you got the worst of the worst who are appointed to the COG and are directing the nation into a system where COGs take total control. We'll talk about that when we talk about the Bay Area's COG, where they take total control under the direction of these sickos who want to change America forever and deny us all the rights that have historically existed by simply being American. This is a new form of government. It eliminates local government. It substitutes the COG, no elected officials to the COG, who follow a federalized, internationalized program for the creation of a new world order.
Right. And incidentally, of course, you mentioned this, the collectivism that's behind this, but this is a program, this is a plan that fits extremely well with the Soviet concept, the communist concept of planning through professionals and leaving local voices out of the policy making, because those local voices represent individuals, and this is not about individualism, it's about collectivism. And this is not only an American program, this is going all over the world, isn't it?
Well, it sure is. There are COGs in Australia. They're spelled a little differently. They're COAGs. They're councils of Australian government. They do exactly the same thing. Australia is further along than America is to becoming the first nation state of a collectivized globalist world. As in bad a shape as California is, places like Australia need to be examined because they're doing exactly the same thing. They're just further down the road in having implemented it. So it is an international thing. It's certainly happening in Europe. China doesn't need COGs because they're already centralized the way the COGs intend to centralize the rest of the world. And so it's the great hope behind this blackness is that when Americans stand up and say no to the champion of collectivism, Hillary Clinton, and elect a guy like Donald Trump who turns the whole one world order scenario on its head, we've got to have a basis for some real hope.
Yes, I agree with that. That is something that's happened over the last year with Donald Trump that I don't think most of the average Americans fully understand or fully comprehend. And I think that most Americans fail to understand that this was literally a battle for life and death in this country under a representative elected government.
That's right. I mean, if COGs succeed, representative government will be a thing of the past. And when that happens, you can expect population to plummet and living conditions to become quite miserable for most people.
Mm-hmm. Well,
we've got
Michael,
a big battle on our hands.
Well, the thing is that I know right now there is a battle going on in this country that people are finally starting to see, and the attacks on Donald Trump, it's not because of the little things that they try to make into really nasty things. It's the fact that he has shown a nationalist attitude that is strongly opposed to this globalism concept of an international socialist communist new world order. And he is literally saying, no, the United States must be sovereign, and we must continue to work to turn our country back to the local governments and national sovereignty that made it so successful. Tell our listeners, you've been working in Southern California, Northern California, or Central California, I guess, with a lawsuit that's been happening now for some time. You've really been in the trenches. Maybe tell people how you even got involved in this in the first place, working with your property in Santa Cruz, and how you discovered all this stuff when you actually, tried to do some zoning or some work on your own property.
Well, that's a long story, but the essence of it was I owned some incredible land in the coastal, very close to the coastline in southern Santa Cruz County. An absolutely gorgeous piece of property that was just a weed-infested lot that you couldn't even walk across because you couldn't get through the poison oak and the mass amounts of non-native weeds, and that was 35 years ago. And so 70 acres along Highway 1 on the west side, and I dug right in as a young guy and said, I'm going to get all the weeds out of here. Well, that was a crazy idea, but 35 years later, it has uniquely been successful. The most spectacular native plant-oriented property I think you'll find outside the Alpine in California in the entire state. Well, that got me in real disfavor with the local government. And, after a lot of study, I learned why and what Santa Cruz County was up to. And lo and behold, they were a centerpiece, along with a few other cities around the country, back in the 80s and 90s, in this program called UN Agenda 21 and its implementation. Their COGs and their operation are completely consistent with the ideas behind UN Agenda 21. And so one thing led to another, and I began to learn about it more, and by 2000 I was actively engaged with others in exposing Agenda 21. And that process continued. It made me put me in worse and worse condition with local authorities. And as a consequence, I was absolutely prohibited from doing anything with my property. And, lawsuits ensued and got nowhere. And so I ended up just building some things, and the county has sort of backed off me. But I've left Santa Cruz County, and I feel like an exile. Santa Cruz has certainly been the leader in California in advancing this Agenda 21 proposal, such that today it's not Santa Cruz residents that are in the grand threat of this UN takedown. It's Bay Area cities, because to the extent we were able to stymie things somewhat in Santa Cruz, it's the Bay Area generally, the much larger area to the north of us that covers 7 million people and 101 cities that has adopted the ultimate Agenda 21 program, which is the COG call it transformation of the way American government works. And the San Francisco COG, which is called ABAG, the Association of Bay Area Governments, has taken the lead across the country in advancing the COG to the place that it's intended to go, which is to have complete control over the region's economic, political, and social activity. And ABAG has promoted now a program called Plan Bay Area, which does exactly that, and we'll talk about that in some detail as the show proceeds.
Mm-hmm. Okay, good. Well, I know you've been in the forefront on this. You filed a number of lawsuits to try to stop this process from going forward, and I know you're right in the middle of one right now that if you can win this lawsuit and shut the Bay Area government program, or at least put a real thorn in their side, this could turn this whole concept of councils of government completely around. And I as we get further into the show, I want you to be able to kind of explain how you've done that, and maybe tell our listeners ways too that they can help you with this process as well, because I know you're funding this entire thing pretty much by yourself, and it really will affect the entire country.
Well, maybe we can start that process. I'll give a little history on the lawsuit and the status. I mean, the status is the curious part at this point in time. We filed the lawsuit back in 2013 or 14, and the trial court made a rather clumsy and desperate attack to deal with this matter, really to defend the COG dynamic. And they issued a tentative opinion in 2015, and it was pretty nonsensical. In a brief oral argument that counsel has before the opinion becomes final, our counsel just decimated the court's tentative ruling. And so the court didn't change its results, just changed its reasoning and issued another nonsensical ruling that legitimized the activities of the COG. And so we took that on appeal, and we wrote the briefs and submitted the briefs. I mean, I think an impartial reading of those briefs would say, the winner of this case is pretty obvious. I mean, we've got a brilliant counsel and the brilliant writings that were submitted to the court, and now they've been before the state appellate court now for almost 2 years without a single word from the California State Appellate Court. There were several cases filed against the Planned Bay Area, all of which were summarily dismissed by appellate courts 2 years ago. And so now ours is the only case that proceeds, and it proceeds by just sitting there. The court has done nothing in 2 years to address this issue. In fact, ABAG 6 months ago went to the court and said, you got to drop this case. It's old and moldy. We've changed our plan. And so the lawsuit is no longer relevant. The court didn't respond to that, which is appropriate, and gave absolutely no response to anybody with respect to ABAG's wish to have the case dismissed. And still, the case just sits there waiting for a determination. Now, if I were ABAG, in fact, I think this is the case, I'd be getting very nervous. In fact, there's a report from the Mountain View newspaper. There's very little press on the subject in any respect, but this was an exception. And here, the relatively independent newspaper proclaimed that we in Mountain View are doing all of our good progressive work, and we are implementing the zoning changes that ABAG required us to make in order to take us down this path toward, COG perfection. And that means all cities, all 101 cities, in order to get their piece of a $15 billion pie that was paid out by ABAG to cities who adopted the zoning that was consistent with ABAG's desire. And that means massive zoning for stack and pack housing, zero zoning for single-family homes, and zoning for transportation improvements that clusters all these stack and packs into, we'll call it bus and train zones, where train stations exist and bus stations exist, so these stack and pack buildings can be built without garages. A key element of the COG proposals are to get people out of their cars, put them in places where they can be totally dependent upon public transportation and or footwork, meaning you walk your way to work. And every one of these 101 cities have adopted that zoning protocol in order to satisfy COG management and to get their piece of this $15 billion payout You got to understand, if you're living across America, you say, "Oh, it's California. They're crazy fruits and nuts in the first place. Who cares?" Well, you're the ones paying for this. You pay the $15 billion that funds the COGs early payments of these programs. The ultimate plan by the COG, I'm not talking about the building of buildings, I'm talking about their incentive monies for the implementation of their program, is $300 billion. Everybody in the country is paying for that. Not only will you pay it here in the Bay Area for our redo, but coming after the Bay Area is Los Angeles and San Diego with the same program in the works, just waiting for our lawsuit to clear before they announce their own programs. And once it has taken over California, there's a COG in your neighborhood, and they plan to do the same thing.
Oh yeah, we've
so
seen
everybody
that,
has a vested interest in the outcome.
Michael, we've seen that same thing. It's actually happening in Bozeman, Montana. They are building right on the sidewalk, multi-story. They're normally 4-story, with retail on the first floor and apartments above them for another 2 or 3 floors, and no parking. They're built right on the sidewalk. They're meant to be bicycle only, and they are meant to be on public transportation. And I think they call that TOD, transportation-oriented development, and TOD, it literally is everywhere in the country right now.
Absolutely, and that proves the point that this has, some other objective, because you can argue, if you're in the San Francisco Bay Area, that some of this is necessary because it's hard to get around. They've already, before this, have consolidated so much development that it's virtually impossible, especially with a governor like Brown, to have enough roads to handle the autos. And so here there's a natural inclination to say, well, we need to get some cars off the road. But what's the excuse in Bozeman, Montana? Well, the excuse there is, it's the world order. We're doing it not to save you transportation time on the freeway. We're doing it to take control, and that's where you really see the objective for what it is. It's a takeover, and it's a takedown of America.
Well, and you mentioned Agenda 21. One of the primary goals of Agenda 21, and actually we'll talk about that a little more detail too later in the program. But one of the primary goals of UN Agenda 21 is the elimination of single-family residences and the creation of stack and pack housing. And we're talking nationwide, not just a regional thing. And,
worldwide.
Worldwide, really. And it was what our good friend who died last summer, Dr. Michael Kaufman, on our show, as a matter of fact, he referred to that as human kennels. We will be the ones in the kennels, in the confinement, and it'll be a natural world all around us that we will not have access to.
Well, that's exactly right. I carve one caveat to that. Those of us who are lucky enough to survive to that point, you've got to remember that UN Agenda 21 calls for a population reduction down to 800,000 people. That's worldwide.
Right.
That's from 7 billion to 800,000. That's over a 90% reduction. That's what they're looking
Michael,
for.
we've got a commercial break coming on. I can hear that, but please hold that thought, and we'll get back to that right after the commercial break.
This is The Micro Effect. www.themicroeffect.com.
welcome back to our listeners, and welcome back to Connecting the Dots with Dan Happel. And today, my guest is Michael Shaw, and we were talking about UN Agenda 21. And incidentally, I'm going to, before we get back into that discussion, mention that Debbie Boscalupi has got her Radioactive Wednesday program coming on tomorrow morning at the same time that we do our program from 8 till 10 Pacific time. And her program tomorrow, she has Representative Matt Shea from Washington and Ammon Bundy, and they'll be talking about just exactly some of the programs that are going on in the West that implement many of these UN Agenda 21 programs. So, and Debbie is, I think our listeners who are following her realize she's really doing a terrific job. She's got a wonderful radio show. And I thought I'd mention that, Michael, because you and I are both friends of Debbie, and she has been a real soldier in the fight against UN Agenda 21. And maybe go ahead, let's talk about all the cornerstones, the main planks, as it were, of UN Agenda 21, which incidentally are many of the same planks that are in the Marxist planks of the communist system. So anyway, go ahead and tell our listeners some of the things that they are planning to do through UN Agenda 21 and how that fits so well with COG and regionalism planning methods.
Well, okay. I mean, I think we start with saying that the COG is the method for the implementation of Agenda 21. It is the action plan for actually bringing these policies to bear. But Agenda 21 in general is a plan for the restructure of how human beings live. We're to live in the air. We're to be without property rights. We're to be without natural rights. We become, our humanity is stripped. The idea is that government is centralized on a worldwide basis and deployed on a regional basis. That is one area of another area, and another area, all coordinated from a political perspective, from the same ideological perspective, and that's where the COGs come in. They become the political arm for the implementation and initiation of this worldwide structure, where human beings are of no more consequence than any animal species. It is a total stripping of the Western psychology of human beings as being made in the image and likeness of God and having rights that are imbued within them by our Creator and that are refined by a subservient civil law that seeks to protect those natural rights of every human being. Now, the American effort in doing this, people will say, hasn't been perfect. And, well, one can only say, well, that's the process of getting better. And the problem in America today is that we're not getting better. We're slipping back into this medieval mindset that centralizes power and authority. And that was the magic of the American experiment, was that we were going to decentralize power and decentralize authority, putting that focus on local government, the government closest to the people, the government with the most power. And this is always to be done through representative structures. And what Agenda 21 seeks to do is to eliminate that centralized power on the highest level possible, disseminate it through this regional concept, which has no rules. It's just an area, just an amorphous area that the powers that be can then direct as they choose. The idea they've chosen is that all the people are to be packed into limited areas, and the rest of the landscape is to be off limits to regular human beings. I say regular human beings because there's this other higher class of human beings under the Agenda 21 protocol that says some people rule and some people enjoy, and the rest is either suffer, die, or survive. It is a totally anti-American concept. The fact that it's gotten as far as it has ought to scare people. The fact that California can be seriously on the verge of a massive investment into restructuring California to meet this confine is heartbreaking. And it's important for California's sake, if not for the country's, that we get out of this. Jerry Brown has been a big proponent of UN Agenda 21, speaking at UN conferences going back 20 years. And, today that crazy man has us on the verge of total destruction.
Right.
And people thinking about coming to California need to think twice. People who are in California are leaving. We're going to end up with a voter bloc here made up of non-citizens electing the Kamala Harrises and the Jerry Browns and the Dianne Feinsteins now and forever, because I don't see things in California from a voter base changing anytime soon.
And one of the things that's come out of that, of course, is the fact that now California, with the combination of income tax and sales tax and property tax and all the taxes that are there, the states that are the worst states as far as being upside down because of debt problems, and at the same time the highest tax states are the ones that are trying the hardest to implement all these UN Agenda 21 programs. California's one, Illinois is one, New York State is one. There are a lot of areas that, because of this UN Agenda 21 policy that they're trying to implement, it literally destroys the economy, the local economy, because as Maggie Thatcher famously said, the problem with socialism is that eventually you run out of other people's money. And people are leaving the state of California in droves, at least some of the wealthier ones, because they see the future for the state of California, and it's going to be very confiscatory as far as taking from those who have and giving to those who haven't. And there's a reason that a lot of people are poor, and there's a reason that some people are rich. And quite frankly, most of that is part of the American system, and we used to promote that idea that you pulled yourself up by your bootstraps. And that isn't the case anymore. Is that right, Michael?
Well, I think that's right, but I wouldn't characterize this as we're going to shift the money from the rich to the poor and let the poor, rise up and be happy. The real goal is to eliminate the people. So, shifting the wealth, destroying the wealthy, is just a precursor to the loss of life that's going to follow. So if you're not wealthy and you take joy in seeing a transfer of this wealth, don't get too happy too fast, because good things are not intended for those folks either.
Well, and the idea of taking the wealth.
That's why we need Trump's program of jobs in America and productivity here and opportunity that comes with that. And that is the American answer. And, this collectivization through internationalization is the program that puts us all on a path to misery.
Right. Well, I'm gonna tell our listeners some of the things that are listed under UN Agenda 21 and their outline of what needs to be changed for implementation of UN Agenda 21. First of all, the elimination of all private property ownership and rights. All forms of crop irrigation, pesticides, and commercial fertilizers, except when they're approved for big agribusiness like Monsanto, ADM, etc. Livestock production and most meat consumption. We will be living in a vegetarian world. Privately owned vehicles and personal travel will be eliminated. The burning of fossil fuels for energy production or for personal vehicular travel will be eliminated. Single-family homes and suburban communities will be eliminated, will be forced into stack and pack housing. Most forms of mineral extraction, mining and public lands, timber harvesting will be eliminated. Dams, reservoirs, golf courses, ski lodge, and vacation resorts will all be eliminated because they say that is too difficult, too hard on the environment. And then finally, and this is something you've really mentioned and we need to stress, the permanent human population needs to be reduced to fewer than 1 billion people. Now, with that, the best way to eliminate people is to take away their ability to feed themselves and to make them dependent on a system and to destroy their ability for self-sufficiency. That is certainly something that is happening under UN Agenda 21, and these councils of government and regionalism are ways that that's being made to happen. Michael, tell our listeners what you've seen in the Fresno area, in the Central Valley of California, some of the things they've done there to eliminate food production.
Well, so much of the land of the Central Valley is now being recaptured for environmental purposes. If you've been to the Central Valley, it's not a very inspiring geography. It's flat, it's hot, it's cold in the winter, but it grows America's foodstuffs. But if you go there now, you'll find that a large percent of the land has simply gone fallow. Gone fallow. This is the most productive ag land in the world. Now, sure, 100 years ago, lots of actions were taken, including the importation of water that created this, what once was a swamp, into this very fertile ag land. But the green movement in California has progressively, over the last number of decades, shut increasing amounts of land in the Central Valley off from farming activities. Now that means we're more dependent upon importing our food. Lots of fun there. And it means that American productivity is not going into the manufacture of our food, meaning a lot of people without jobs. It means that a lot of landowners have simply gone broke. That was intended. And, it's a real window into the transformation that is occurring as a result of this globalist movement. And all Americans ought to be concerned about that. I mean, California is an important, productive part of the American experience. Now, there are those in California who say California should secede from the United States. And that movement may gain steam over the next year. We'll see. But, without changing the direction California is currently on, most of us, I think, would say, well, good riddance. Those of us who are living here are going to leave. And, Google, Apple, and Facebook will be all that's left. And this state will begin its continuing process of economic suffering. You say, how can California be suffering? Well, its state budget is in woeful shape. And with the money is being spent to transform California into this globalist output post. It's no wonder that our coffers are shrinking and our opportunities are vanishing, and the state's system, whether we're looking at roads or whatever, is not faring too well, but probably a whole lot better today than it will be in 5 years. So, the clarion call is out for California to shape itself up, reduce this crazy tax burden, encourage people to become productive, put some reasonable restraints on the mass influx of people south of the border that has really put the state on the brink of ruin. I'd like to, Dan, give some specifics on how the ABAG plan is intended to operate and what the more technical objections from an operating perspective that we have identified in our lawsuit, and that I think have hung up the California courts to this point of freeze. They're frozen. They don't know what to do. But I think the issues that the proponents of the COG, the proponents thereby of Agenda 21, the globalists behind the scene here in California, what it is that trips them up in the implementation of this $300 billion program for the Bay Area called Plan Bay Area. Because if we understand some of those specifics, it becomes easier for people across the country when they're faced with the same thing, because you will be. I mean, everybody's doing it, but not with full force that California is ready to embark upon. I mean, you talk about Bozeman with their 3-story apartments without garages with shopping underneath. That's designed to keep you on your block so you can be more easily monitored and controlled as time moves forward. And here in California, the plan is arranged in accordance with state law called SB 375. Now, people not too familiar with California, part of the reason we're in such trouble is that we are a one-party state. There are no Republicans in statewide office in the state. There are no prospects for any Republican to gain office statewide in the state. If you're in this state and you have a driver's license, and anybody from anywhere in the world can get a driver's license in California. If you have a driver's license, that makes you entitled to vote.
Well, and I know
think about that if you're in America.
Well, and I know that California has been one of the areas that has fought the hardest to make sure that we have an open border policy. And part of that open border policy is designed to bring voters into the country who will vote for the Democratic Party. Not that many of the Republicans aren't just about the same thing. I mean,
right.
Bottom line is we've got almost a one-party system nationwide, which I would call Republicrats or Democrats. But the reality is that in the Republican Party, there are some Tea Party folks. There are some independents in there that don't believe in progressive socialism and actually believe in our republic. And one of the biggest things to implement UN Agenda 21 and regionalism is to eliminate borders and to the best way to end national sovereignty and let's say a national political state, as it were, is to eliminate the borders to those countries and just make it a big hodgepodge. That's what's happening in California, right?
Absolutely. I mean, it's for somebody who grew up here, it's astronomical, the changes that have happened over the last 50 years, and it is the immigration policy, and it was Jerry Brown with his motor voter legislation that brought to us the condition that if you're here, you get a driver's license. If you have a driver's license, well, when you get that license, you can sign up to vote. No requirement to be an American. If you're in California, you get to vote. And there's some protection, even if they're two parties of the same color, like Democrats and Republicans. There's still some advantage to a two-party system because they're bound to find disagreement. We just look at Congress to see that. In California, there is no such disagreement because with this, with the thrust provided by the non-citizen voter, Democrats are assured of every victory every time. And so they begin to rule like Fidel Castro does. And, I nominate Jerry Brown for the Fidel Castro Award for the 21st century because he is a Castroite. And California is going the way of Cuba. In fact, I always say, I used to say, I'm not there anymore, but where are you from? I would say Cuba, California. Because our policies accept that they kill people in Cuba for not going along. Here they just steal your property. And there's no question the primary objective of Agenda 21 is the abolition of private property. Mm-hmm. And, switching back to the COG, the purpose of COGs, in one sense, is to create what they call priority development areas. Now, priority development area is a small area where they want to focus maximum development of stack and packs. The priority development areas for the Bay Area have been identified, and zoning for these areas has happened in every city but one. And the requirement for a priority development area is that it must be a regional transportation hub. That means trains and buses. And then within half a mile of those trains and bus stations, which have to be developed, are a half-mile radius where stack and pack, which you described in Montana, only much higher stories, will be developed. And the purpose of doing these priority development area stack and packs is to accommodate 80% of all new development in the Bay Area for the next 20 years. So they intend to build over 600,000 stack and pack units here in the Bay Area in that time frame. Mm-hmm. Now, in addition to the priority development areas, they have what they call priority conservation areas. These are in the hills along the Bay Area that are pretty natural. There are people living there, but they have priority conservation areas, which are to be devoted exclusively to open space, meaning that all the houses there must be eliminated. Meaning also that if you own rural land, you've been divested of any property right because you can't build. All the housing is to be stack and pack, primarily located in these priority development areas. So they take the entire Bay Area and map it without any consideration of any property rights. In fact, only with the idea of eviscerating property rights. And, that's the vision that people in the Bay Area can see coming down the road. 66% of all commercial development must be in these priority development areas. I mean, very little development will happen outside these areas. And inside the areas, if you're a landowner, you can't build what you want. You've got to build the stack and pack that's been designed for implementation there. So what ends up happening is the partners of government buy the priority.
Michael, we're moving into a commercial break right now. I can hear the music, but hold that thought, and we'll get right back into that when we get back from our break.
This is The Micro Effect. www.themicroeffect.com.
Okay, welcome back to Connecting the Dots with Dan Happel, and my guest today is Mr. Michael Shaw, and Michael and I were talking about the UN Agenda 21 and some of the programs that are happening in California and how they literally will open up the same kind of programs through regionalism and councils of government. They'll open up those programs nationwide, and people need to be aware that you can be in one of the most rural areas of the United States, and these programs are being implemented right before your very eyes. And they all promote collectivism and socialism. And I'm going to read a quote, and this was from the policy statement of the United Nations Conference on Human Settlements. This was Habitat 1. This was in Vancouver, British Columbia, in 1976. And this is Agenda Item 10, and it says, quote, land cannot be treated as an ordinary asset controlled by individuals and subject to the pressures and inefficiencies of the market. Private land ownership is also a principal instrument of the accumulation concentration of wealth and therefore contributes to social injustice. If unchecked, it may become a major obstacle in the planning and implementation of development schemes, unquote. Now, this was 1976. We need to understand that the UN is a communist-controlled organization. It has from the very inception. If you look at the Human Rights Declaration in the UN Agenda 21, it's virtually identical to the Human Rights Declaration in the 1936 Soviet Constitution. There is a reason that all these programs stem from the United Nations, and they all want world government, and they want a world government under a communist, Marxist, feudalist system that will control every aspect of your life and everything that you do. And Michael, I would like to use that as a lead-in for you to continue your thoughts about what's going on in California and how that disease is being spread nationwide.
Well, you know, the synopsis you gave is exactly on. And what COGs do is implement that 1976 UN statement about how property needs to be collectivized, private property is an evil force, and how everything needs to be centralized and controlled. And, of course, that's what COG does. It takes private property away. It puts development into the hands of public-private partners, that is, those who will do the business of government. And it causes everybody else to just be a loser, because you've lost what you had. You thought you owned that land, but you can't use it because you're not part of the centralized scheme that has plans for your property. The idea that individuals control their destiny is an idea that is lost with the philosophy that is embodied in the statements that you just read. And that was 1976. Now we're in 2017, and you know, COG is the vehicle that implements all that you just summarized. And that's why everyone needs to know what a COG is. When you're in the 8th grade, you learn about the 3 levels of government. You don't learn about COGs. But the future, in the view of those who are controlling our political system today, especially here in California, has nothing to do with those three levels of government: local, state, and national. It has to do with the forces of regionalism and the forces of collectivism, all organized under the policies that are implemented by the COG. And let's talk about those a little bit more, and talk a little bit about what we've identified as the weakness that exists in this COG system as it applies to the Bay Area specifically, and their outrageous plans to remake at least the Bay Area, if not the world, as time rolls along. What happened was the Democrat Assembly of the state of California passed a bill called SB 375. And SB 375 is the framework for the operation of COGs in the state in terms of its current phase. That is the phase where it overwhelms local government and neutralizes. The objective is to completely neutralize the effect and the operation of local government, to replace local government elected representatives with a regional system of appointed parties run all aspects of government at the local level. That sounds pretty outrageous, but there's some requirements laid out in this bill called 375 that have to be met in order to do that. And what we've focused on most keenly has been the requirement that the plan to implement 375 as to be determined and created by COGs has to be a feasible plan. That means it has to be something that can be obtained within a specified time frame for the complete takedown of local government. So what we asked the trial court is we said, we'll look at these issues of feasibility and determine whether or not these objectives can be made. And the trial court did a rather haphazard effort in doing that, but they were honest to this extent. The ruling held that this program may obtain its results. Well, the word feasible is defined in 375 as saying it will achieve its results. Well, to achieve the results the ABAG expects from the Planned Bay Area, they have to have a completely new structure of taxation in California. And key to achieving that, in their own words, in the words of their advisors, is that Prop 13 has to be repealed. For those who don't know, Prop 13 is what limits our property taxes in California. Well, they have to repeal that so they can really drive out the private landowners by taxing them to death for property they cannot use. Well, what's feasible about that? Does anybody think California is going to reject Prop 13? If so, that's a pretty speculative statement if you think that's going to happen. It's certainly not meeting the definition of feasible as set out by the California Democratic Legislature. So we say to the courts, hey, this plan isn't feasible for many reasons which we lay out in our briefs. But one of the key ones amongst those is the idea that you're not going to get rid of Prop 13 in California to make this plan actually work. So how can you say it will work when, the bad guys are saddled with the idea that property taxes in this state are limited?
Well, and Michael, one of the caveats of that is that most people, even though they may go along with these programs and they really Even some of them believe in a lot of this stuff. When it comes to their own wallet, a lot of these people will say, no, I don't want to raise my property taxes to some unsustainable level. Well, the whole concept of collectivism is based on the elimination of private property. And the only way you can eliminate private property is in the United States, certainly in California too, is to make it so expensive and so cost prohibitive to own land because the taxes are so high that people don't want to be landowners anymore.
That's right. And you know, I think behind the scenes, that's what they're seeking to do. But, you know, when you put it that way, you're right also. Very few people are going to support it. So they do have some brick walls they have to get through. And, you know, the way a magician gets through a brick wall is by deceit. And I think that that's what we're facing with California's politics today. We are being deceived. And, you know, my hope is that this litigation, which people can read the briefs and get more up to date by visiting globalizationofcalifornia.com. We're in the process of updating that website, but you can see the court filings that are posted there. But you know, our objective is to bring to light the tomfoolery that our state government is subjecting the people of California with a plan to ultimately subdue all of the American people to this plan of centralized collectivism that will ruin your life. So our real hope is that the courts, and it'll probably be the California State Supreme Court that makes the ultimate decision. We got to get out of the appellate court first. The courts come to their senses and just rule this whole transformation of the American political experience as null and void, and nubs it for the rest of the country right here at its hot spot, so that people in Arizona and New Mexico and Iowa and Rhode Island don't have to do the same thing that we're having to endure here in California.
Right. Well, and I know for a fact that this is going on all over the country, because in my travels, I have seen this stack and pack housing, and it's typically 4 or 5 story buildings that have retail on the first floor and then apartment units up above them. And I've seen literally in almost every city in the country that I've been through, there are block after block after block of these kind of developments. And this is exactly what the planning commissions and planning departments literally all over the country are doing, is creating this type of housing because it's easy to reproduce, and it is based on local what's called transportation-oriented development. It has no automobiles. It's bicycles, it's buses, it's trains, it's local stuff, and it's intended to eliminate property rights. And incidentally, I don't know if our listeners are completely aware of what these apartment units, typically they're around 350 to 400 square feet. They not only are apartments, but they're also designed to be small apartments that minimize the footprint of the people who occupy them. And that is actually growing smaller all the time. I think probably they'd just as soon have us in a file drawer somewhere, those of us that are left that survive the mess that they've got planned for us. Michael,
a file drawer or a coffin. I mean,
yeah, or a coffin. Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah. Tell us a little bit more about some of the things that you are trying to accomplish with your lawsuit, and how specifically these items are going to change the way the courts view, what this lawsuit is about and what is part of the ABAG and other programs like it.
Well, I think what we're trying to do is take a two-step approach here. And the first step, which is the focus of this lawsuit, is to stop Plan Bay Area. While we can acknowledge that everywhere is conducting these stack and pack experiments in cities every place, the reality is that you need to fully implement that, you need a whole new governmental vision and development style to really make that work in the long term. And that's why the COG is so important, because the COG is what brings that new guiding principle so that people can be clustered and controlled in the way that Agenda 21 anticipates. And so if we can knock down this structural rehabilitation of our law and our system in this lawsuit, we will go a long way toward protecting ourselves from the evil that is designed by the globalists through this world system of government that is floundering as we build these stack and packs, but which comes to a point of organization if we implement the COG reforms that they're trying to impose upon us. Our lawsuit is designed to terminate that. And if we succeed, there'll be a second phase where we will, on more philosophical grounds, as opposed to the practical grounds that we're objecting to now, on philosophical grounds, we'll attempt to eradicate COGs. Because we take away their political mechanism for the world order, and that political mechanism is not Agenda 21. The political mechanism is COGs. If we can eliminate COGs, we take away the threat. It hangs like the sword of Damocles over our necks for all of us, not just those of us in California. As they move forward with their COG implementation, they create the world they have longed for, with universal control over the actions of every individual in a way that renders that individual as something or someone who has no power and no responsibility for a life that otherwise had been their own, but which is now controlled by an international governmental system. COGs are necessary under the scheme they have had going for 100 years now to make that happen. This lawsuit has the potential of destroying that. And if we fail, well, my hope is the word gets out that we've failed, and now we're under massive threat. I'm hopeful we don't fail. And by the signs of the court, they're having a hard time. By the inaction of the court, my suspicion is that they're having a hard time justifying this total transformation of law and reason with the activities of COGs nationwide as exemplified at the forefront by ABAG, the Bay Area COG. Everybody would expect across the country that if there was any place where such craziness would begin, be the Bay Area, which has produced such luminaries as Barbara Boxer, Dianne Feinstein, and Jerry Brown, and the rest of the California.
Right. No, you're right on the money.
Brought us to this place.
Well, I want to remind our listeners that always the same thing happens in their vision of the New World Order. Property is the one thing that is completely eliminated, or at least private property. And I want to do a couple other quotes that V.I. Lenin, the first Soviet dictator, this is a quote he made when he was defining what Marxism or communism really was. And he said, communism can best be defined as the elimination of private property, unquote. And then Prince Philip, who this is Elizabeth's husband, and he was also one of the founding members of the World Wildlife Fund. And incidentally, I don't think a lot of people realize Prince Philip is a communist and good friends with Fidel Castro, or was when Castro was alive. But one of his quotes is, quote, "We reject the idea of private property," unquote. That is the mindset that is behind this globalist plan, which creates this regionalism in these councils of government. And now they're attacking our school systems by implementing Common Core and other programs that are UN-based programs to teach our kids collectivism, to teach our kids that private property and ownership is selfishness, and sharing and collectivism is good. And that's the way they plan to take us down in the long term, is by educating our children and attacking our schools. Michael, you're certainly aware of that, and they're doing that in a big way in California, right?
Oh, yeah. My last two children, they were put in government schools, and that's probably the best move I ever made as an adult. Their minds are a lot freer than many of their contemporaries are, because they've got a basic understanding of up and down, right and wrong, good and bad, and that's from a political and moral perspective. Government schools today just lead little people in states of mass confusion and misdirection. And if I had any advice for friends and family, it would be do the same. Educate your own children. And sure, we'd like to, widen that spectrum, but don't widen it so wide that you let anything in by sending them to government schools, because you don't know what's going to come out. I've spoken to various organizations and some women's organizations, where women who are mostly grandmother age, literally start crying because they feel they did the wrong thing by sending their kids, who are now off supporting this globalist concept, and they attribute that to the fact that they sent them to government schools. And this can be heartbreaking for people who are 50 years old and have grown children, and they're just on the wrong march, and mom and dad know that, but there's nothing they can do about that, because they surrendered direction when they sent to schools that have the objective to create children who are marching to the globalist tune.
No, that's right.
And that's especially true here in California.
The whole program is designed to collectivize our kids' mentality, to teach them that the right way is through relinquishing their private rights and their private ownership and their private thoughts, and become part of a bigger collective of, globalism, regionalism, and all the other things that they're trying to sell. And all I can say is that, Michael, this is a plan that they've had in place for a long time.
That's right. They're trying to bring it to fruition. The consequences here in California of this, what I'll call unfeasible plan. The law requires it be feasible. I think we demonstrated clearly in our briefs the plan is not feasible for lots of reasons. But the consequences, if it gets implemented, is that cities will lose control. Your city government will mean nothing. It will simply be an arm of the COG doing what the COG tells them to do. This is the restructure of American government. And cities will be coerced to follow the plan. I mean, coerced. Huge money available. If you play, no money if you don't. And everybody seems to respond to money. And so that's how they know they can, they can squeeze you into the position they want you to be in. And landowner rights will be eliminated. There'll be no such thing as private property under the COG implementation. It's one thing for cities to follow the stack and pack program, but in theory, land outside their zoning for stack and pack, you still have some property rights. Under COG implementation of a program like Planned Bay Area, property rights will increasingly become non-existent. So we've all got something to lose. Both the federal and the California Constitution are premised upon a Republican form of government which preserves and protects land control for the individual.
That's right.
Planned
Michael, I'm sorry, we're moving into another commercial break, but hold that thought, and we'll pick it up right after the break.
Great.
This is The Micro Effect.
www.themicroeffect.com.
Well, welcome back to Connecting the Dots with Dan Happel. And today my guest is Michael Shaw. And while we still have the opportunity to do so, I want to remind our listeners to tune in tomorrow to Debbie Boscalupi's Radio Active Wednesday. And that show tomorrow, she will have a return of Ammon Bundy, and she'll also have Washington State Representative Matt Shade to come on and talk about the kill list that has been exposed for the Bundys, and how that all came about. That Debbie has her program on from 8 till 10 Pacific time on the Micro Effect, and I just want to remind our listeners to please tune in. She's doing a terrific job, and Michael, I'm sure you're as proud of her as I am. She's doing great things to try to expose what's going on in this country. And let's continue your thoughts on the One Bay Area and your trial, and then let's talk about what people can do to make things better and how we can fight this system.
Okay. Well, I want to end with 2 points under the Planned Bay Area dynamic. Our form of government, as I was talking before we broke, our form of government, a Republican form of government, guarantees us and protects our rights to property. It protects our rights to our own life.
Joe, did we lose Michael?
Yeah, I'm not sure what happened there. He just dropped off. Shows his line is still connected, though.
There, am I heard now?
Okay, good. Yeah. I'm not sure what
sorry.
happened there, but we lost you for a while.
Okay, well, all I'm saying is that our state and federal constitutions are premised under a Republican form of government which preserves and protects our land control and so many other rights. The Planned Bay Area transforms these principles under the guise of sustainability. Sustainability is the monster in the room, and it's something that people need to understand where it came from, what it's about, and where it will lead us. Now, one other concept, there's many that, like I say, you can review at Globalization of California, but one other important concept that we're using to battle Planned Bay Area is based on the concept of equal protection. You see, Planned Bay Area gives an exemption to its public-private partners building these stack and pack units. California has an extremely comprehensive law called CEQA, the California Environmental Quality Act, which makes development in this state impossible, and which has led to a massive shortage of housing. So what Planned Bay Area plans to do is to carve an exception in the CEQA Act that all stack and packs dedicated to low-income housing will be exempt from the rules that everybody else has got to follow. You say, well, how can that be fair? Well, they argue, well, the poor people need it. But it violates equal protection. The idea that poor people can get welfare is not something that violates equal protection, because there's a relationship a direct relationship between poor people and welfare as a partial solution to that. But when you exempt low-income housing from the entire statutory act that everybody else has to follow, you're violating the equal protection rules. Mm-hmm. Because the whole reason why they exempt, the reason we have the CEQA rules in the first place are to reduce greenhouse gases. Well, exempting poor people from greenhouse gases has no relationship to the fact that they're poor. Welfare payments do. So you're violating equal protection. If you're poor, you don't have to follow it because we want to protect greenhouse gases, not because we want to help poor people in particular. We're using poor people as the excuse to further this faulty concept of greenhouse gases, exempting them and requiring everybody else to have to follow these exorbitant rules. Mm-hmm. So that's a violation of equal protection, because the disparate treatment is not rationally related to the reduction of greenhouse gases. And so they're just picking different groups to treat them differently because they're all powerful, not because they're predicated in justice, reason, or anything good.
Well, and you know, Michael, you know that obviously the difference between a democracy and a republic is that a republic protects the rule of law. A republic protects the rights of the minority, of the individual, and of the minority against mob rule, against the power of the masses. And democracy is literally mob rule. So the reason they want democracy, which is communism, instead of a republic, which is individualism, is that they can eliminate those rights of the individual under rule of law. And that's exactly what you're talking about.
I think you're right. So you asked what people can do. Well, follow the California dynamic. It will not be publicized. You'll have to search out your information. Globalization of California is one such form for doing that. But what I would do if I lived in, somewhere Iowa, is I would find out what my COG is. They always have innocuous titles like Association of Bay Area Governments, or in Southern California, it's Southern California Area Government. I would find out what my COG is, and I do the really difficult part of this whole thing, which is to find out when and where they meet, because they're very secretive. And I'd show up at their meetings because you are an American. You can show up at their meetings. And people in Southern California have begun doing this. And it's begun to awaken Southern Californians as to the existence of the doings of the COG. You need to do that where you live, because they're not just wasting their time. They're doing all the dirty work the Association for Bay Area Governments has been doing for decades. And they're just waiting for California to show a success model. And they will have their own planned Bay Area for, everywhere. Mm-hmm. Every inch of ground in America is covered by a COG, except for a few areas that have massive federal land holdings. Like there are places in Montana that are not covered by COGs. But 99% of all America, and where all the people live, there is a COG in effect. Their objective is to do exactly what's happening in the Bay Area. And if you think you're immune from what's happening here in Northern California, you're simply wrong, because the groundwork has already been done where it is you live, and they're just waiting for the California dynamic to be approved by the courts before they begin a massive rollout across the country of the same program.
Mm-hmm.
And I can what I've seen and known, Donald Trump has done nothing on this subject. And it's time he wake up and take on the COGs, because we can attack it from the ground, a couple of people, taking on Planned Bay Area. But Washington, D.C., it's a Washington establishment system. The system of COGs is a Washington, D.C. establishment system. Pressure needs to be put on the Trump administration to get rid of COGs.
Right, I agree.
There's nothing we could do to salvage America that would have more of a profound effect than to abandon the COG movement.
I agree. And Michael, I can tell you in rural Montana, in Madison County, in rural Montana, we're a county of many thousand square miles that is one of the bigger counties in the state of Montana. We have a population of right at 8,000 people in that county. And yet we have a county planner who, incidentally, was the president of the Montana Planning Association and a real advocate of the American Planning Association and all these ICLEI programs that are around. And they are promoting the concept of regional travel schemes for wildlife, travel corridors they call them, where they claim that you can't have people there because this is the natural travel corridors for grizzly bears and lynx and all these different creatures. And so you've got to eliminate people in the areas where they have these travel corridors, but anyone who's lived in those travel corridors, and I'm one of them, realizes that that's where all the game go, is where we live, because in fact we create a habitat that's much better for the game than the areas around it.
Well, that concept is a universal one here in San Jose. South San Jose is off limits for the same reason. They want the animals to be able to travel from the Sierras to the beach, and so the Coyote Valley is off limits to development, and it's preserved for animal passage. This is happening all over the country. This is all part of Agenda 21. It's all implemented through COGs. And, the American public needs to, see this picture in a clearer light. You cannot count, it's where Trump's been masterful, on anything mainstream to give you the information, because mainstream is controlled by those operatives who want to see a transformation. And what our job is to make sure that the public knows what this transformation means, and how it's not in their interest to abandon the American experiment. And that's what the COG dynamic is all about. We are to abandon our system of government where it counts the most. That's the local level. We're to abandon that to a system of unelected, unaccountable bureaucrats who make decisions in conformity with the globalist development objectives. And that will leave you and me and everybody listening to us out to lunch.
No, that's
out
right.
Without lunch. So the time is now to begin to really understand what's going on. And if people want to follow our case and help us when it comes time to go to the California Supreme Court, just check in with us at either Freedom Advocates or Globalization of California, and we'll eagerly accept contributions for that as soon as we're ready for it. And of course, we're just waiting for the appellate courts to make a decision.
Well, and that's something you're bringing up, an important point. We are up against the fake news, against the establishment press, against the establishment who are almost to a person or an organization promoting this globalist concept and promoting collectivism. And we're up against a very, very significant foe here. And it's important for our listeners to realize how important alternative media really is. And we did a program a couple of weeks ago telling our listeners, please support this network, support our work, and do it in substantial ways. Support our sponsors, buy their products, support the station. We are trying to get a couple of satellite links up and running, and that takes money. And the only way we're going to be able to do that is with the support of our listeners. And we don't have George Soros, and we don't have these globalists, the Rockefeller Fund, and all these different groups that we're fighting, helping us to promote the truth. They're promoting the other side, so it's important that our listeners support what we're doing. And I, incidentally, a week ago, a young friend of mine from Montana helped me put a donate button on my danhappel.com website. So if anyone is interested in helping us to try to expand this station and to expand our listenership, please go to the danhappel.com website, and there is a donate button on there. And please help us with this effort, because we're doing all this out of our own pockets. Michael, you've done this entire lawsuit out of your own pocket.
Well, we have had contributions to trial operations, so I won't take credit for doing it all, but I paid a heavy price and contribution myself for certain. But I don't want to be mindless about the contributions that we have received, which were greatly appreciated.
Well, they are appreciated, and we need some folks with the ability to help us to come forward and start putting a little effort into our effort to create a truthful, open intellect and programs that promote what's really going on in this country so that we can move forward and tell more people in a wider area what's really going on. Michael, your program and what you're doing through Freedom Advocates, I'd like you to tell people what Freedom Advocates is all about. You've done some really powerful, wonderful things through that group. Tell our listeners what you're all about.
Well, Freedom Advocates was formed in 2000, and in response, primarily at that time, to early activities taken on by Santa Cruz County, kind of a leader in the sustainability movement across the United States. And, we, by 2006, had shifted our focus from local sustainability issues to national issues of Agenda 21 sustainability, and, grew from there. And so we have writings assessing this dynamic, both practically and philosophically, written by a number of people who were all contributors to the Freedom Advocates portfolio. In 2014, our site was undermined and destroyed, essentially, by robots. I presume, but I'm not offering proof. That was a focused takedown, and so we've spent the last few years reassembling what we can and reposting the site. It's substantially completed and certainly ready for study by young people or grown people. But it does give tremendous insights as to the nature, origin, and purpose of Agenda 21, and the nature and salvation that the principles of America provide for battling this grandest threat that's ever defaced the American Republic. So I would encourage people to check it out. It will continue to improve, especially the homepage, but there's tremendously good sources there, tremendously appropriate for young people to review and understand, and I would encourage people to do that.
Well, I would too, and having known you the way I do, I have to say, Michael, you're one of the true American patriots. I know you've been in a number of film efforts in exposing UN Agenda 21, and I just hope our listeners will follow what you're doing, support what you're doing, and understand we are on the edge of losing our country. Michael, thank you again for being our guest, and I look forward for the next time that we get together.
Well, it's a pleasure, Dan, and I thank you very much, and I look forward to that as well.
All right. Thank you.